Hello and greetings to all from wherever you've joined us today for this first System Change, Not Climate Change webinar in 2020. Our topic today is using our power to stop climate disaster and create a just world. My name's Ted Franklin. I'm a labor and climate justice activist based in Oakland, California. I'm hosting this virtual event from unceded Ohlone territory in the San Francisco Bay Area. And at the outset, I want to acknowledge the unusual moment we are living in. Last night, many people took to the streets here in Oakland, as in other cities across the United States, to protest police brutality, honor the legacy of John Lewis, and challenge the misuse of federal forces in Portland. For those of us who are not familiar with system change, not climate change, it is about 7 years old. We're an evolving network of ecosocialists living primarily in the United States and Canada. As Aaron Roy has said, we're passing through a portal now. We don't know where the portal leads, and much of it is up to us. And at times like this, we urgently look to the past for insights that can guide us. We hope today's visit with historian activist Jeremy Brecher will contribute to this effort. System Change, Not Climate Change, co-hosted the first large eco-socialist convergence in New York City in 2014. That event was attended by 2,000 participants. Since then, we've been networking and communicating with the world through a variety of channels: our website, our Facebook page, our listserv, our newsletters, and our online forums. If you're interested in plugging in, I'll post information in the chat on how to connect with us, and in the Zoom chat, and as well as in the Facebook live stream. You can always find your way to our website by Googling System Change, Not Climate Change. Some of you are joining us by Zoom, and some are watching via the live stream on our Facebook page. We're not activating the Zoom chat today because we want to encourage everyone to focus on what Jeremy has to say. Today, we're thrilled to have Jeremy Brecher as the first guest in our webinar series. Here to introduce Jeremy is Carol Dansereau, a System Change, Not Climate Change organizer in Seattle. Carol is the author of What It Will Take: Rejecting Dead Ends and False Friends in the Fight for the Earth, which I highly recommend. Before I hand off to Carol, we want to give a shout out to our many Facebook co-hosts today: PM Press, Labor Network for Sustainability, Friends of the Earth US, Mazaska Talks, The Climate Mobilization, Labor for Standing Rock, Stop the Money Pipeline, Extinction Rebellion Justice, General Strike 2020, the IWW Environmental Union Caucus, and the Bay Area and Colorado local chapters of System Change, Not Climate Change. Carol?
Great. Am I spotlighted? I will wait until, there I am. Thank you so much, Ted, and good morning, everyone. I should say good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. It is an honor to introduce our speaker, Jeremy Brecher. Jeremy is a writer, historian, and activist. He is the author of more than 15 books on labor and social movements. PM Press recently published an updated 50th anniversary edition of his book, Strike, which has been described as, quote, the single most important book about the history of the American labor movement published in our time, unquote. Strike narrates the dramatic story of repeated massive revolts by ordinary working people. It documents the power we have when we unite to withhold our labor and withdraw our cooperation. Active in the fight against global warming since the 1970s, Jeremy has written 3 books on climate: Climate Insurgency, A Strategy for Survival, Climate Solidarity, Workers versus Warming, and Against Doom, a Climate Insurgency Manual. He is a co-founder of the Labor Network for Sustainability, which is a powerful, organized voice within the labor movement for ecological sustainability, where he serves as policy and research director. Jeremy's invaluable commentaries on solidarity and survival appear regularly on the LNS website. So now, without further ado, we welcome Jeremy Brecher, whose topic again is Strike, Using Our Power to Stop Climate Disaster and Create a Just World. Jeremy will speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll answer questions which many of you have submitted in advance and which I will present to him. We will end our session at the 75-minute mark. Jeremy, when you've spoken about 28 minutes, I will try as politely as possible to butt in and give you a 2-minute warning. So thank you very much for being here, Jeremy. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be with you all. I want to thank the participants who are here for coming to this. And I want to say that I think it illustrates one of the most important things that's happening right now, which is our movements are developing ways to function and express themselves and let people find a way to express themselves and act in spite of COVID-19, in spite of the tremendous obstacles that this pandemic is presenting to democracy and to people's action. Nonetheless, we're finding ways around that. And I think this event and your participation in this event is a excellent example of that, and one that we're finding ways both virtually online and on the streets to be able to make our movements be effective in spite of the virus. I also want to thank the organizers of this event for pulling it together and for all the other work that they've been doing to bring climate issues and other issues of working people and questions of the distribution of power in our society together. They asked me to talk about 3 themes, and that will be the kind of outline of my talk. The first one is strikes and the power of strikes and where it comes from. The second is they asked me to talk a little about strikes, mass action, and the New Deal as an example of how strikes and organized action can actually make a difference and, in fact, contribute to systems change. And then they asked me to talk a little bit about today and the things we're facing in this immediate moment. So that's an overview of where we're going. Our story starts around 1500 BC. Egyptian workers at Deir el-Medina hadn't been paid for 3 weeks. They stopped working and walked out. It may be history's first recorded strike. So 3,500 years ago in Egypt. And what you find is that the nature of strikes, the way they work has changed enormously, as you would think, over the millennia. But there's 2 things that have been constant. One is when some people have to work for other people, as individuals, they are normally powerless. They can simply be disposed of, as one union organizer I interviewed at length said. They say, well, if a man doesn't want to work, I'll just get another man. But the other side is that when you have solidarity, when workers, and it goes beyond that to other oppressed peoples, are able to act in common, they have a power that grows from that, that can counter the powerlessness that they have as individuals. And the strike is a perfect example. What is a strike? Well, as the Deir el-Medina story illustrates, it's a collective refusal of employees to work. But it's actually been very much generalized beyond that. So we're familiar with people talking about student strikes, rent strikes, hunger strikes, sympathy strikes, general strikes, mass strikes, political strikes, and other forms of strike. And what is it that all these have in common? I think we often feel that intuitively there's something that brings these not just miscellaneous things being covered under one name, but something deep that they have in common. And I think what they all have in common is they show people attempting to influence their conditions and their society by collectively withdrawing from the normal activities of life and thereby disrupting them. It's been used by workers, it's been used by abolitionists to abolish slavery, civil rights for equality, women's liberation, Polish solidarity movement for the overthrow of the party dictatorship in Poland, many movements for democratization from the Philippines to Latin America, where it often went under the name People Power, and very much in the gay rights movement. So widely used and widely effective in making significant social change. But that raises the obvious question: in a situation where the powerful seem to have so much power and where ordinary people seem to have so little power, why is it that strikes and other forms of people's action are able to change society despite the power of the powerful and the power of powerful institutions? I think the hint lies hidden in a poem by Bertolt Brecht called From a German War Primer, where he wrote, "General, your tank is a strong vehicle. It breaks down a forest and crushes 100 people. But it has one fault. It needs a driver." The point being, the power of the general is dependent on that driver. More broadly, domination depends on support or acquiescence. After all, what makes society work? What makes it go? Is people going to work, paying taxes, buying products, obeying government officials, staying off private property. And today, especially with, since thinking about Portland and Seattle, staying off government property. All those things recreate the power of the powerful. And it was all summed up by Gandhi, who, after studying at the time the Russian Revolution of 1905 as it was happening, said, "Even the most powerful cannot rule without the cooperation of the ruled." Now, how does that get parlayed, that dependence get parlayed into power? I think the secret of that is told in a song that was the anthem of the labor movement and in many places still is, called Solidarity Forever. It has the lines, "They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn." And that dependence of employers, bosses, and society as a whole on the cooperation and the labor of the people who seem to be the powerless ones is what makes ordinary people potentially powerful and provides a potential power that we have to learn to utilize and mobilize if we want to make systems change and, in fact, protect ourselves from the destruction of our world and our lives. So that's the broad picture, and we're going to see as we go along lots of examples that illustrate that fundamental fact about power. And I'm going to, of the hundreds of examples I could choose and the hundreds of examples that are covered in my book, Strike. I'm going to take one that the organizers of this gathering suggested that I tell a little about, which is the impact of strikes and direct action on in the early years of the Great Depression, affecting the role of government and eventually the New Deal and the rise of the mass industrial labor movement in the 1930s. One thing I've learned as I've gone along, continuing to study the history of strikes and working class movements, as well as other social movements, is how intertwined strikes and direct action are with other forms of systems change in governing structures, change in economic structures, and a powerful example, and it's one that we should all be thinking about today as we face a period of mass unemployment that is unrivaled since the Great Depression, and in fact is very much on the same scale as the Great Depression. It was the movements of the unemployed in that period of economic dislocation and misery and unemployment of 20 or 25% of the population, looking a lot like what we're seeing today in terms of the rate of unemployment, and at least twice as extensive unemployment as anything since, including the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. And what you had in the Great Depression was a period where government, generally speaking, was totally opposed to providing any support for the unemployed and for the destitute. And you had hungry people going into grocery stores in groups and saying, we don't want to hurt anybody, but we have to eat, and telling the clerks to get out of the way while they loaded up and took their food out in the carts. That was the level of desperation people were facing. And in that context, unemployed organized in unemployed councils. They held hunger marches. They occupied city governments and state capitals, and demanding relief, demanding food, demanding there was no social security, no welfare, no nothing but private charity at that time. And they forced, first of all, city governments and then state governments to start making provision, of course, completely inadequate, but still something to survive with. And then ultimately, the pressure of state and city governments, along with the direct pressure of desperate unemployed people, led the federal government to reverse its position and start providing welfare, start providing food, and eventually start providing jobs for the millions and millions of unemployed. It actually started even before the New Deal, but with the coming of the New Deal, the Federal Relief Administration and legislation reversed the adamant opposition to support for the unemployed and began providing, first of all, food and other necessities, and then eventually jobs. So, and I'll talk a little later about what some of the implications might be of that for the unemployment crisis of the coronavirus depression era. But let me go on to talk about the 1934 strike wave and the Wagner Act. 1934 saw a series of desperate, often violent strikes. For example, what up to that time was the largest strike in the United States history of textile workers throughout the South and New England, with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people participating, scores of people shot dead by police and National Guard, pitched battles between police and National Guard and striking workers, and a police and employer raid of terror in the textile towns throughout the South and New England. I've had people look at the pictures of it in strike and say, what are you doing? Is this a book about the Civil War? A second one that had a tremendous impact was in Toledo, Ohio, where the most where 20,000 people in a plant that hired, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000, called the Autolite plant. Tens of thousands of people showed up, battled the National Guard, and surrounded the plant, prevented strikebreakers from going in, and eventually forced the settlement of the strike and the rehiring of the workers. And the thing that was most impressive about the Toledo Autolite strike was that tens of thousands of unemployed workers, instead of going in and trying to take the jobs of the strikers, joined the strikers and supported them in surrounding the plant and engaging in mass picketing, so that you really had an alliance of the workers who had been in the plant, the unemployed workers of the surrounding area, joining together because they saw it as a common struggle. And again, as we'll see, the relationship between unemployed workers and so-called essential workers, those who are still on their jobs, and the more who are being forced to go back to their jobs, whether they're in any meaningful sense impressive, essential or not, finding some kind of common ground there is going to be an important part of the struggle that we need to engage in today. There were also two general strikes in 1934. One of them was the San Francisco General Strike, and one was the Minneapolis General Strike, both extremely powerful, both with severe repression from the police, National Guard, company guards, and pitched battles, people killed, and eventually the strikers being able to prevail in both cases. And I won't try to tell those stories here, but you'll find a good introduction to them in my book, Strike. But what the point for this talk is that the next year, Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, which was known as the Wagner Act, which for the revolutionized the legal rights of workers and gave workers a legal right to organize and to engage in concerted action, and required employers to bargain with them. That might just have been a nice piece of paper, but almost simultaneously with the Wagner Act came the sit-down strikes, in which hundreds of thousands of workers occupied their factories. The movement spread to hundreds of factories and other workplaces, stores, schools, all kinds of places. There's a wonderful study of the Supreme Court facing the Wagner Act, and all previous decisions would have said, oh, this is illegal, we're going to declare the Wagner Act unconstitutional, and instead they reversed the long legal traditions and said, okay, we have to do this. And there is a wonderful essay showing that there's no other explanation of why the Supreme Court reversed itself, except that the factories were occupied, they were facing a huge labor upsurge, what seemed like a threat to industry and a threat to civilization, and they thought, well, we better go along and accommodate to this challenge. So the overall effect of the mass strikes of the 1930s was to transform power relations in American industry. Didn't abolish capitalism, but it revolutionized the relation between workers and employers on the job. Okay, let's fast forward to today. And there's, needless to say, a lot we could talk about in the meantime, but let's see what some of these things mean in terms of the situation we face today. When I was revising strike, it was clear that there was a change around the beginning of the 21st century from the conventional strikes and even unconventional strikes of the preceding 150 years, and the kinds of mass actions and working class movements that we saw starting after the beginning of the 21st century. I started calling them the mini revolts of the 21st century. They often involved strikes, but they also involved a wide range of other direct action tactics and other forms of mobilization. And they involved issues that were not just the issues of a particular group of workers vis-a-vis their employers, but very often broad social issues that affected wide swaths of workers, or even all workers, and more broadly, everyone in society. And an example of that would be the climate strikes that started as student strikes, spread from one young student, as we know, who just sat down in front of the Swedish Parliament building with a sign saying "Student Strike for Climate," and then spread around Europe, and then spread to the United States and Australia and Africa and Latin America. And eventually the students, after doing a student strike for climate every month, and in some places every week, after they had had millions of young people involved, said, okay, now it's time for us to invite the adults to join us. And I'm sure many of you participated one way or another, September 20th of last year, in the climate strikes, which were the largest climate demonstrations ever in the world, and some of the largest demonstrations in the history of the world, and represented a putting up the issue of climate front and center basically every country in the world, and laying the groundwork for further waves of climate strikes and climate action of the kind that I have been referring to as a climate insurgency, a global climate insurgency, to challenge the legitimacy of governments and power holders in the fossil fuel industry. Now, of course, as we know, there was a plan for an even larger, much larger and much more forceful strike on Earth Day, on the 50th anniversary of the original Earth Day. And as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic intervened and made it extremely difficult to have that kind of mass mobilization, especially right then. It was right in the aftermath of the beginning of the pandemic, and we hadn't yet learned how do you do it, how do you hold a mass movement, mass actions in the context of the COVID-19 virus, which, as this meeting here today shows, is something we've learned a lot about how to do. But the student strikes have continued online, and I think that we'll find, especially as awareness and consciousness of the devastating effects of climate change become more and more widespread, which they definitely have continued to do through the coronavirus period. I think we're going to find new forms and more expanded forms of climate strikes in the years ahead. But in the meantime, we've seen things that are completely unprecedented, and I'm going to try to compress here because I think we're running a little short on time. But we've seen a wave of coronavirus strikes. In the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, after a few weeks, little stories began appearing about workers here, one place or another, in a bus terminal in Detroit or in a hospital somewhere, walking out because they didn't have personal protective equipment and proper public health policies to protect them. And that has grown into an incredible strike movement. First, there were 2 or 3 that I heard about. Then there were 10. Then there were 20. Then after a while, there were 100. A website called Payday Report began collecting word of them because most of them weren't reported at all. And they said between March 1 and May 31, they recorded 260 strikes for coronavirus protection around the country. Most of them wildcats, most of them not at least publicly supported by unions, but organized by workers who felt that they had the need and the right to protect themselves.
Jeremy, we're at the 2-minute warning, please.
Okay, I'm going to pull it to a close. And of course, this stuff, people are more than welcome to talk about. When we get to questions, we will go into what are things that I didn't get to here. So the Black Lives Matter uprising, which I'm sure also that many of you have participated in, is again a unique expression of self-mobilization and self-organization. And one of the things that isn't known, I didn't know it, is that we saw the strike for Black Lives Matter, which is, again, a unique phenomenon, and is really, as far as I know, one of the very, very few cases where substantial numbers of workers have gone on strike for an issue that is not a workplace issue. It's not an issue between them and their employer, but it's a fundamental social issue. Workers in 25 cities participated. I think 5 large national unions supported the movement, not calling out their members on a large scale, but supporting the idea of strike type actions around the country. And again, according to payroll report, there were more than 600 strikes of one kind or another as part of that strike for Black Lives in a period of 2 weeks. The one other thing I want to touch on here, and I mentioned it before, is the question of mass unemployment. There are almost half of American adults are not working. They are either officially unemployed or they're not counted as unemployed because they're not actively looking for work. The last figure I saw combining those two was 48% of adults. And of course, a large proportion of the people aren't looking for work. It's not because they don't want to work, it's because they know there are no jobs out there. Now, the stimulus payments have kept people in large part able to pay rent and get food and survive in other ways. And that's crashing. And it's very clear that we're about to go into either no stimulus payments or a severely curtailed kind of support. And we're going to have tens of millions of people who are destitute, who are going to be losing their houses, their homes. They're going to be losing the means to pay rent. They're losing already, many millions have lost their health insurance when they lose their jobs, and there's going to be millions more facing that. And it seems to me that looking at the experience of the 1930s, there is a tremendous need for unemployed people to organize themselves and fight for the kind of stimulus package, the kind of federal aid that they will need in order to survive. And there are unemployed organizations that have developed in the COVID-19 pandemic. They are primarily online networks that developed in many states and many industries to fight to get the unemployment payments and the other forms of support that people were entitled to and that they weren't getting because they were all snafu'd in the government bureaucracies. And there have been substantial organizing and protesting around that. So I think we've got a starting point, and I would say especially to those of you who are yourselves unemployed, there's a need for all the unemployed to organize themselves and say, wait, this is about us. There are about 6 Republican senators who are holding up the HEROES Act, which is the bill that was passed by the House that includes support for, I won't try to run through all the groups, but most of those who are going to be most devastated when the current support runs out. There's really an opportunity, wide open opportunity for a new form of organization and action. That's something that we should be thinking about.
We're over time, Jeremy, so if
Yep.
you could wrap up, that would be great.
So why don't I stop right there? And I'm sure that the other points I'd be making will come up in question period.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that very, very informative and valuable presentation, Jeremy. And we will jump right into questions. There were a lot of people asking questions about the relationship between strikes, as in work stoppages, and other forms of resistance. I will read one from Dave Jones. You've stated that, quote, the boundary line between what's a strike and what's a movement has really blurred, unquote, and that mass mobilization is necessary to stave off climate destruction. Do you see the blurred boundary between strikes and other forms of popular resistance as problematic in any way, and elaborate more on how work stoppages fit together with these other sorts of actions, protests, student strikes, civil disobedience, occupations, etc., in the context of climate justice work and our shrinking timeline.
What was the last line?
In the context of climate justice work and our shrinking timeline, as in we don't have much time to save ourselves.
Right. Excellent question. And I don't have a cut and dried answer to it because I think this question is being reshaped as we speak by history and by people's action. It's certain the answer would certainly not have been the same before and after the climate strikes, and it's not even the same before and after Black Lives Matter and strike for Black Lives Matter. So this is definitely a moving target, but it's still a good question to be asking, and it's one that we need to keep asking as we're going along. First of all, I think it's worth recognizing that the dependence of employers on workers is an extremely clear and specific example of the broader role of dependence in people's power. And for that reason, there is a particular power that definitely has traits of its own in a strike by workers because they have such a direct opportunity to use the dependence to force to make a problem for their employers. When people go out in the street and block a street, they make a problem for the drivers who want to go through. But if their purpose is to affect, let's say, a government policy, it doesn't have nearly as direct effect as when workers prevent production in a workplace and employers start losing money every day. So there is definitely there are specific characteristics of labor strikes, worker strikes, that define it as not just one more case of people utilizing the dependence in parlaying it into power. Historically, especially in the United States, the main tradition of worker strikes, and especially of union strikes, has focused on the relation between workers and their immediate employers, and it focused on issues that employers could be pressured to affect. So wages, hours, working conditions being the most common ones. And there's a story that I grew up on of a strike where workers won a full set of demands for wages, hours, and working conditions. And in those days, many strikes added "Free Tom Mooney," which was a slogan about a union organizer who had been framed up and put in jail. And the story is of the boss coming and saying, "I'll give you shorter hours, I'll give you higher wages, we'll clean up the working conditions, but how can I free Tom Mooney?" And the point of this being, a strike has great power. A regular worker strike has, in some ways, more power vis-a-vis the direct employer, but it has not so much power in terms of broad social issues, generally speaking. There are exceptions, and certainly in countries where political general strikes are part of the union and working class tradition, there are many instances of strike being used for broader social issues. But I think that why don't I stop there? This question may come back up in other forms, but I think especially when it comes to climate, this is something that affects everyone, including people in workplaces. And what we're going to need to do is have a climate movement that is also eventually using the power of the workplace strike and eventually using the power of general strikes. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think that's a strategic perspective that we need to have in mind.
The next question indeed kind of picks up the general strike question and flows from that. It's from David Klein, and lots of people were asking this kind of question. What would be the most powerful and unifying explicit demands of a general strike? Do these include demands to address the climate and ecological crises? And he has a follow-up that I'll read now. He points out that to address the ecological crises, we do indeed need to achieve net zero carbon emissions in the very near future. So can you outline a possible sequence of steps that could achieve this from the starting point of a general strike?
Let me start by saying two things. I think that a general strike is definitely a tactic that's going to be necessary, and because it's one of the most powerful things that could possibly be done. It needs to be seen not as an isolated event, but as part of an ongoing movement and what I call a climate insurgency, which is prepared to challenge the power and the legitimacy of governments and fossil fuel industries. And the general strike is a tactic, a tool within that. And in itself, we're not going to have a general strike and then the fossil fuel industry is going to give up and just say, okay, we'll stop pulling the shit out of the ground. It's not, that's not the way it's going to work. And the government is not going to say, okay, there's just too many of you. We're just going to say, okay, you can do what you want. Go ahead and shut down the pipelines. It's going to be a protracted, even though it has to have a very rapid timeline, it's going to be an ongoing protracted struggle that has to escalate over time. And there's going to be lots of building blocks. And I think I probably shouldn't try to lay out a scenario here, but as was mentioned, I have 3 books on climate insurgency and climate movement strategy. And they're very much designed to lay out stages and steps and how to mobilize and utilize the power of the people who are the victims of climate change and who are also the people whose activity makes up society and could stop it and force these problems to be addressed. You'll find a lot about that in those 3 books, which are 2 of them are available free on my website, and the 3rd is available from PM Press. And also in my commentaries on solidarity and survival on the Labor Network for Sustainability website, there is quite a bit, especially from the time of the climate strikes, that looks at what would be next steps from the climate strikes that we've had to the next level of climate mobilization.
Thank you. I'm tempted to push you and force you to share with us a sequence of how we save ourselves, but I can see that it is a big topic, and we want to be able to continue this conversation. I personally would propose another meeting where we explicitly focus on that question, but we'll talk about that later. Let's see. From David Klein again, his final question in that series was, which sectors of the economy do you think are most open at this time to militant labor actions and strikes?
One thing I've learned from labor history is that you can't predict what people are going to do. And I will just give you, I could give you many, many examples. In fact, one of the most striking things, so to speak, about this subject is the way in which very often strikes emerge where they're least expected and where nobody expected them except for the people who were there, who noticed that people are getting angrier and angrier, that they're pulling little kinds of actions, that they're standing up to the bosses in ways they didn't before, and supporting each other in ways they didn't before, that are completely invisible outside. So I would say, if you want to know the answer to that, the only way to know is to go to talk to the people who might be the ones to pull the next strike. And I said I would give one example of the unexpectedness. I think if you had said 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, who would be the least likely people in the United States to strike, it might well have been teachers in West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona. It was just completely out of anyone's imagination that they would have been people who would have struck. And yet those three groups of teachers pulled probably certainly the most dramatic and probably the most highest impact strikes that have been held in the United States in recent years. Again, if you want a history of that, get the most recent edition of Strike. So who would be next? I think also fast food workers are people that would have been put way, way up on the list of least likely to strike. And we know that Fight for 15 and fast food workers and other low-wage workers have invented new ways to strike, new kinds of strikes on a massive scale that has actually had more impact on raising wages. You'll find the documentation for this in Strike than any other kind of labor action in many, many years. So who's next? All I can say is, if you want to know, go out and start talking to people, especially talk to the people you're working with. By the way, these coronavirus strikes for personal protective equipment would be another example of strikes that were completely, no one would have imagined or talked about until the workers themselves started doing them. So talk to people where you work and start finding where the beginnings of feeling that, geez, we've just got to do something about this, where people feel we can't take it anymore, we've just got to do something about this. That's where the next strike wave will be.
Now a question from Harry Gregory. He asks about strikes as a tactic to achieve the level of system change that we need and the logistics of making that happen. And more explicitly, he asks, how do we make it big enough? How do we sustain it long enough? How do we provide people, especially the people on strike, with what they will need to sustain a strike?
Well, I want to go back to what I said at the beginning of this discussion, that the strikes and general strikes should not be seen as isolated, and this is especially relevant in terms of the climate movement. They should not be seen as single isolated events. They are a means of exercising power for the climate movement, and a means not only of halting the functioning of those who are perpetuating climate change, but undermining their legitimacy and drawing together all the people whose lives and future they're destroying to act in a cooperative way. There will be other expressions that are also part of the power equation. And those range from, I just got a message today from the Sunrise Movement saying that they're going to have rowdy demonstrations, loud, noisy demonstrations in front of the politicians who have been the main barriers to addressing climate and addressing also COVID-19 protection and the other things that we have to stand up to. And they're going to do it every day for the next 100 days. And I think some of the people on this call would be very appropriate people to join those actions. They're not conventional strikes, but they are very much in line with the broader concept of strikes that we've been talking about today. So, and I think those are just as much a part of mobilizing, creating the power that we're going to need as more conventional strikes. There have been, by the way, some strikes specifically about climate. The one that got the most attention was the Amazon workers' strike during one of the strikes for climate, where a substantial number of Amazon workers walked out and held rallies outside Amazon offices and so on. And there have been a few others. Again, my columns, my commentaries have tracked the ones that I'm aware of. But as far as going to scale, I think there are two critical things. There's an awful lot to talk about in this, and I would again say that my 3 climate insurgency books address this at quite a bit more length. But I think there are two things that I'd hold up now. One is it's essential that the climate movement not only address climate, but that it address other needs that people have, because people live in a world where it's not just climate, it's not the only thing they have to worry about. This is even more so in the coronavirus depression, where just literally putting food on the table and keeping a roof over the head is going to be the overwhelming principal concern for tens of millions of people. And in the era of Black Lives Matter, where the issue of injustice has come front and center for not only people of color, but for a very substantial part of the overall population, judging by participation in the movement and by poll data. So I think that is a crucial part of going to scale. I think what gets talked about as a just transition, people who are afraid that climate protection is going to mean the loss of their jobs and their livelihoods and the destruction of their communities. Going to scale involves addressing those concerns and seeing, as the Green New Deal is the great way of showing, that there is actually a great deal to be gained for working people if we put people to work addressing the climate crisis. And why don't I stop right there? There's obviously many more aspects to it. But.
Right. You actually morphed right into what I was going to do as the next question. So maybe you could elaborate just a little further on just transitions. It is a question from Steve Ongerth. Given the collapse in oil prices, how can we build a movement capable of reaching the workers in the affected industries? We're going to see increasing pressure by the fossil fuel capitalists to bail out their corporations, attempts by them to divide workers and climate justice activists, etc. But when the chips are down, the bosses will walk away with the bailout money and stick it to both the workers and communities. So if you could comment on that and specifically answer that first question with a little bit more detail about how to build the movement capable of reaching the workers in the affected industries.
Right. Well, the first thing is whenever we talk about climate policies, to talk about what are we going to do to protect those workers and communities too, because the tax base of these companies is crucial to the education and other social programs of the communities where the plants and mines and wells and so on are located. So we need to talk specifically about what we're going to do to protect them, and not just, oh, there'll be plenty of jobs fixing the climate, so we don't really have to worry about where the people who lose their jobs are going to find new ones. If you look on the website of the Labor Network for Sustainability, you'll find a lot of material, a lot of it by me, a lot of it by other people, case studies of communities that have taken steps to have a just transition, policies that are the elements of what need to be combined with climate protection to protect workers and communities. So we need to talk about it. We need to include it in our programs. That one other thing relevant to the immediate situation is we used to think about this as, well, there'll be a power plant closed down here, and there'll be a mine or a well closed down there, and it's sort of going to those spots and finding jobs for people and making sure there's we talk about a workers' bill of rights for people who are affected negatively by the transition to a clean energy economy. But we've got a situation now where 25 million people have officially been laid off. As I said before, about almost half of the adult population is not employed. And last estimate, a study I saw said that 42% of those who have lost their jobs in the COVID-19 depression have lost them permanently. They are not going to go back to their old jobs. So the question of a just transition suddenly becomes a question not for 5% of the workforce who work in the fossil fuel industry, but for the a huge swath of the population as a whole. And that's, it's a question that is barely being addressed yet. And let me just say, in a preliminary way, I think the Green New Deal was on the right track. That what we have to do is create jobs, fixing the climate and fixing our communities and fixing all the ways in which people of color and discriminated against groups are in deficit in transportation and healthcare and every other dimension of our society. We need to focus on making those desperate needs, now made much more desperate in the aftermath of the coronavirus depression. We need to make those front and center in the availability of new jobs. I think we need to do something like what was done in the Great Depression with the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, which put millions of people to work meeting the needs of communities and society in the Great Depression with the issue of climate change and the transition to a climate-safe economy front and center. And one other piece I would throw in here is there was a Green New Deal plan, and it was a great plan to get from where we were before the coronavirus to at least a substantial part of what the question laid out in terms of a net zero carbon emissions on something like the timetable that we have to do. But we're in a different situation now because we're really in an emergency of daily life And it's going to be even more. We have it from the coronavirus, but we're going to have it more from the coronavirus depression and all the things that are going to go with that. And so I think we need to think not just in terms of the Green New Deal as a kind of orderly laid out plan for getting from the fossil fuel economy to the climate safe economy, and getting from the injustice of our class and race system as we know it today to a more equal, more fair, more just society. But we need to see the start of that as growing out of the emergency situation we're facing, in which millions of people are going to be desperate to find a way, basically just to survive. And if we can have a program for that, a way to do that, that's the starting point also for the broad Green New Deal that we need to make as a whole. I think that's the, as far as the question was asked about what's the starting point, what are the early stages, I think the next stage for us right now is the emergency Green New Deal and the mass movements that are going to be necessary to bring that about.
I'm eyeing the time here, and it's so hard. There's so many great questions, but I think I will jump to this one, which is a practical next steps kind of question. Just wondering, in general, your thoughts on practical next steps for continuing this kind of conversation we're having today. How can we best bring all sorts of people together, all sorts of groups, to talk about strikes and related militant action as the source of our power, talk about aligning our demands, developing strategies together, that kind of stuff. Just practical, who should we be talking to, who, how should we do it? That's my general question. And then I'm also just wondering in specifically what you think of Cooperation Jackson's call to action towards a general strike, which was attempting to foster just exactly this kind of conversation.
I think what you're doing with this forum is great, and this series of forums is great. And I think we need, Lenin said, every cook can govern, and Napoleon said, every private has a marshal's baton in their knapsack. We need to draw together the dialogue that so often goes on in universities and among people who feature themselves as intellectuals, with the dialogue that goes on among ordinary folks who are facing problems and trying to figure out what to do about it. And I think we need to draw those together and see them as part of one dialogue. And I think in terms of the who, I think it would be great to the extent to which we can, not that those aren't appropriate to go on their own tracks, those dialogues, but I think it would be awesome, as I've learned to say, to bring them together in ways where we could have, for example, the people who were doing the coronavirus strikes or doing the strike for Black Lives Matter, participating in forums with people who are thinking about how do we make systems change. So anyway, that's one part of the answer. And I think because we're in a time when a lot of people are active and a lot of those questions are becoming relevant to a lot of people, I think that would be one piece of a next step that I would emphasize. As far as the call for a general strike, by which I believe involved a wide range, maybe 100 organizations, but as I understand it, the lead organization was
Cooperation Jackson.
was Cooperation Jackson. I've consulted with some of the people in it. I sort of gave them some background on the history of general strikes. So I've been, broadly sympathetic to it. I think it's actually extremely positive for people to be talking about general strikes, even if we're not close to being at a time when it's a very likely thing to pull off, because I think it, as the author of a famous essay on the general strike, George Sorel, said long ago, it gives people an image of what the power of workers united actually looks like, and how that workers make up society, and if they strike, society has to stop. And that understanding, whether it can be fully implemented in the short run or not, is a extremely valuable thing for people to learn. And it's something that's popped up a lot recently. In the first Women's March on Washington, for example, there was a follow-up action which was called the Women's General Strike, which had as its objective not thinking that they could have a general strike, but making people think about a general strike and what did it mean about power. Same with Occupy Wall Street, similarly, and I could go through other examples. It's a valuable thing to have out on the table, whether or not it's something that can be realized immediately. I think I'll tell you the sort of advice that I gave to the people who were organizing the May Day general strike effort this spring, which was there were issues that were incredibly pressing for people. The most important and pressing one being, at that time, protection from COVID-19 infection, which is still very much front and center in people's minds. But at that point, the people were just beginning to get sick and die because they had jobs as frontline workers in the COVID pandemic. And the advice I gave them is go and talk to people and find out what's really most on people's minds. What are the things that large numbers of people might want to strike for, or that they would support a strike, whether they struck themselves or not. They would come out and be part of rallies and demonstrations and online actions and so on, and make that front and center in what you portray the strike is about. There's no reason you can't have lots of other demands too and say we're for these things. But as far as defining what this is about millions and tens of millions of American workers whose lives are being threatened by the way the government and the employers are handling the coronavirus pandemic.
We have to wrap up because we're over.
Yep.
But...
Yep. So that's a way of thinking that I would urge, not just in that instance, but in general. We have a role to play in contributing to the things that need to happen towards people mobilizing themselves and organizing themselves, but listening and hearing what is most important to people and what they are willing to act around is a crucial dimension of doing that.
Great. Well, thank you so very much for your presentation and for fielding those questions. We do need to end it there, unfortunately. And when I say end it, I'm referring, of course, to just this online event. because we do want to keep this conversation going. Strikes are an essential tool for achieving the monumental changes we need to make to survive, and System Change, Not Climate Change is eager to join forces with others who share this perspective and want to explicitly discuss how to build a movement capable of engaging in and sustaining system change, advancing strikes and related actions. So this event today was an educational one featuring a speaker with invaluable insights, but we are also interested in being part of strategy sessions with other groups, hosted by us, hosted by others. It doesn't matter, we just need the conversations to talk about building strike capacity and related issues. And I urge you to please communicate with us about this. Use the contact form on our website. We are engaging in precisely the kind of conversations that Jeremy was urging us to all be having. Please look at our points of unity and consider actually joining our network to be part of the planning on these kinds of things. With that, thank you again, Jeremy, for your presentation today. It was wonderful talking with you. And I will now hand it back to you, Ted. Ted, we cannot hear you.
Mute.
Yes, the old unmute trick. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So thank you very much to Jeremy and Carol for a very enlightening session. If folks want to learn more about strikes from the Radical Movement's leading historian on strikes, you can get the 50th anniversary edition of Strike directly from PM Press. I've placed the link there in the chat. Also, I've placed a link to Labor Network for Sustainability, which was co-founded by Jeremy and is an invaluable source of information about what's going on in relationship to labor and climate activism and their intersection. So this is the first in a series of webinars we'll be presenting this year, and we plan to bring guest speakers from many movements confronting the emergency situation that Jeremy spoke of. And that wraps up today's webinar. Please keep an eye out for upcoming webinars that will be as enlightening as today's event. A recording of this webinar will be posted on our Facebook page and on YouTube. And don't forget to connect with us on social media. Take care, be safe, and make the revolution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much,
very
Jeremy.
much.